The warm Atlanta afternoon moved gently across Piedmont Park, but for Robert, time stopped in an instant. One moment he was striding along the path with the confidence of a man who built an empire. The next he froze mid-step, because there she was, Julene, the woman he once promised forever, the woman he hadn't seen in 3 long years, the woman he lost because he didn't know how to love her right. His breath caught, his shoulders tensed, his entire world narrowed to the sight of her, standing beneath the shade of an oak tree, sunlight brushing her face the same way it had the first day he fell for her. He tried to speak her name. Nothing came out. Before he could gather himself, a small voice cut through the air, bright, full of innocence. "Mommy!" A little boy ran toward her with unwavering joy, tiny backpack bouncing, curls shifting in the breeze. Julene dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around him in a hug so warm it almost broke the sky open. Robert stared, unable to move, unable to breathe. The boy turned. Their eyes met. Those eyes. Robert knew those eyes. Brown with a streak of gold, just like his. A chill ran up his spine. His hand instinctively gripped the park bench beside him, as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. His pulse hammered. His throat tightened. He was staring at a younger version of himself, a child with features he could not deny. A child he never knew existed. Julene rose slowly, holding the boy's hand. She stepped forward, her face calm but firm, the way she always looked when she had something heavy to say. Her voice reached him softer than a breeze, but it hit him with the force of a lifetime. "Robert, there's something you should know. Before we go any deeper into this moment at Piedmont Park, let me ask you something real. Have you ever carried a mistake so heavy that you prayed you would never run into the person you hurt? Have you ever walked through a city hoping you wouldn't see someone, not because you disliked them, but because you knew facing them meant facing the truth? Have you ever begged life for a second chance, only for life to show you that you weren't ready when it mattered? Or let me ask it another way. Have you ever wondered how it feels when the past walks right up to you holding a child? Because that's exactly where Robert finds himself right now. And maybe you've been there in your own way, not with a hidden child, but with a broken relationship, a shattered friendship, a bond you wished you handled differently. Sometimes the people we hurt the most are the ones we thought would never leave. Sometimes the apology we meant to give never got delivered. Sometimes timing works against us, and sometimes we work against ourselves. Robert knows that pain. Julene lived that pain. But the truth, a lot of us have lived it too. Whether it's love, family, friendship, or trust, heartbreak doesn't always come from strangers. It comes from the people we let closest to us. And when those people walk away, life doesn't always give a warning before bringing them back. That's why this story matters. Because it asks the same questions we all ask quietly, should every father be told about his child? Can a woman trust again after being betrayed? Can a man change when life forces him to confront himself? Questions that don't have easy answers, but answers that reveal who we truly are. Now before we continue, welcome back to Stories by Mr. Flex, where life's most powerful lessons come wrapped in unforgettable tales. If you're new to this family, thank you for joining us. Please hit that subscribe button because it truly helps us share stories like this on YouTube. This story is about love, mistakes, consequences, and redemption. But to understand why this moment in the park shattered Robert, we need to rewind. Because everything started 3 years ago. To understand why Robert can barely stand right now, why Julene's words feel heavier than the quiet Atlanta breeze, and why that little boy's eyes shook him to his core, we need to talk about the storm that led them here. Because this wasn't just a breakup. This wasn't just a marriage that ran out of love. This was a fracture that split 2 families, 2 worlds, 2 lives straight down the middle. A divorce that embarrassed her family in the West End and stunned his in Buckhead. A betrayal that shattered a woman who had already spent her whole childhood fighting to be seen and respected. A decision that turned Robert into a colder version of himself. A man whose success could fill bank accounts but never fix the emptiness in his chest. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, a child was born. A child who carried his eyes. A child he didn't know existed. But before we even uncover how that happened, or why Julene stayed silent for so long, let's get something clear. Stories like this don't form overnight. They come from choices, from pride, from hurt feelings that never healed, from mistakes that snowballed into consequences nobody was prepared for. That's why this story will take us into the divorce that tore through both families, the betrayal that poisoned what once felt unbreakable, the hidden child that changed the course of Julene's life, the millionaire CEO who realized too late that love is not a boardroom deal, the reunion that will shake Atlanta, and the karma that will come for them all, one decision at a time. But let me ask you, not as a narrator but as someone who knows life hits hard, should every father be told about his child? Should every mother trust a man who once broke her heart? Can a person truly change when life forces them to face what they ran from? These are the questions Robert and Julene will answer in ways they never expected. Because if you've ever loved someone who hurt you, or ever wished for a do-over you never got, this story might feel closer to home than you think. And now, before we jump deeper into how everything fell apart 3 years ago, let me remind you, if you're feeling this story already, go ahead and like this video so YouTube knows to share it with more people who love powerful storytelling. Now, let's go back. Not to the park, not to the reunion, but to the night everything broke. Julene's first night back in West End was quiet in a way she hadn't felt in years. No high ceilings, no polished hardwood floors, no silent judgment floating in the air like it did in Buckhead. Just her mother's small living room, the buzz of the old ceiling fan, and Scott sleeping peacefully in her arms, barely a few months old at the time. It wasn't the life she imagined when she married Robert, but it was the life she had now, and she decided she would make it work. The West End neighborhood welcomed her without question. People didn't pry into why she returned or why she carried a newborn on her hip with no ring on her finger. They simply said, "You home now," and that was enough. Julene moved into her childhood bedroom, the one with the faded paint and the window that overlooked the front yard where she used to jump rope as a girl. Scott's crib fit tightly beside her bed, but she didn't mind. She wanted him close. She wanted him safe. The days came fast. Bills came faster. She found herself working 2 jobs, early mornings at a nearby cafe and late evenings at a community center helping with administrative tasks. Neither paid much, but together they kept the lights on, kept food in the kitchen, and kept diapers stocked. There were nights she came home so tired she had to sit on the edge of the bed for a full minute before picking Scott up from his crib. But the moment he grinned, wide and toothless, she felt strength she didn't know she had. She refused to let her pain turn into bitterness. The neighborhood strengthened her more than she expected. Miss Gloria across the street watched Scott whenever Julene had double shifts. The kids from the block played with him when he got older, chasing him around the yard while he laughed until he fell over. Church friends dropped off meals when they noticed she had been working too many hours. West End didn't give her luxury, but it gave her community. And that community shaped Scott. He grew up hearing stories of resilience, faith, and determination. He learned early that people don't need wealth to be kind. He watched his mother stretch every dollar without ever letting him feel the weight of it. Even at a young age, he sensed her strength. Julene never bad-mouthed Robert, not once, even when she cried at night, silently, so Scott wouldn't hear. Even when she replayed the divorce in her mind and wondered if she should have fought harder or walked away sooner. Even when the pain hit her hardest, her love for Scott became her purpose. Her heartbreak became her fuel. Her dignity returned piece by piece. Some mornings, walking him to the neighborhood daycare, she caught herself smiling, not because life was easy, but because she had survived something she never thought she would. She didn't depend on pity. She built a life. She created joy where there was none. She raised a son who knew laughter more than struggle. She found herself again slowly, naturally, without forcing healing before she was ready. Every time she held Scott's tiny hand, she remembered why she kept going. And yet, there were moments, usually late at night, when she wondered if Robert ever thought about her, if he regretted the fights, if he replayed the words spoken in anger, if he ever imagined the child he didn't know existed. But when those thoughts came, she allowed herself one breath, and then set them aside. She had a son to raise. She had peace to rebuild. She had a life to reclaim. West End became more than a return. It became her rebirth, and while she didn't know it yet, the decisions she made during those 3 years were already shaping the moment she and Robert would meet again at Piedmont Park. This was Julene's new beginning, stronger, wiser, grounded in who she always was before the world complicated everything. And Scott grew up wrapped in love, surrounded by people who saw him as a blessing long before his father ever laid eyes on him. While Julene rebuilt her life in West End, Robert's world in Buckhead quietly crumbled beneath the polished floors and expensive silence of his family's estate. On the outside, he was still the young executive with everything: money, status, connections. But behind closed doors, he was barely holding himself together. The divorce hit harder than he expected, not because of the paperwork, not because of the public whispers in Buckhead, but because losing Julene felt like losing the only person who ever saw him as more than a last name or an asset. His parents never said "we told you so," but their disappointment hung in the air like a weight he couldn't shake. His mother shifted conversations whenever Julene's name came up, pretending the marriage never happened. His father offered business advice instead of emotional support. Neither asked if he was okay. Robert drowned himself in work. If he wasn't in a boardroom, he was behind his laptop. If he wasn't behind his laptop, he was reviewing contracts. If he wasn't reviewing contracts, he was pretending he didn't feel empty. The office became his escape, his punishment, his hiding place. He started spending nights there, first once a week, then twice, then so often that the cleaning crew stopped asking if he planned to go home. They simply learned to vacuum around him while he slept hunched over spreadsheets. Colleagues thought his dedication was admirable. Investors praised him for his focus. His parents thought he was finally shaping into the business leader they always wanted. No one realized he was falling apart. He kept a photo of Julene in one of his desk drawers, not because he wanted to hold on to the marriage. He knew it was broken, but because that photo reminded him of who he was back when he still believed he could be a good husband, back when he still believed he could make someone happy. At times, he would open the drawer without thinking, stare at her smile for a moment, then shut it quickly before guilt swallowed him whole. He replayed their last fight too many times to count. The shouting, the accusations, the pride that kept him from apologizing, the way Julene looked at him, hurt, tired, done. He wondered when the shift happened, when love turned into pressure, when support turned into misunderstanding, when he stopped listening, when she stopped feeling protected. He blamed himself, though he never said it aloud. The stress didn't stop at emotions. Investors questioned his decisions. Projects missed deadlines. He struggled to concentrate in meetings. He caught himself staring off into space while people waited for answers he wasn't ready to give. "Robert, are you sure everything's fine?" his assistant asked once after finding him asleep at his desk. He forced a smile. "Just tired." That became his mantra. Just tired. Just tired. Just tired. But exhaustion wasn't the real problem. The real problem was the loneliness he buried under spreadsheets and contracts. He tried going on dates once or twice, hoping distraction would erase the ache. But every time he found himself comparing the women he met to Julene, their laugh, their patience, the way they carried themselves. Nothing ever felt right. No one ever felt familiar. And the regret? It grew. He regretted the words he spoke in anger. He regretted the nights he walked away instead of listening. He regretted letting pride win every argument. He regretted not chasing her when she left. He regretted thinking their love would fix itself without effort. Sometimes, in the quietest hours of night, he whispered her name without meaning to. Sometimes he wondered what she was doing, if she moved on, if she thought of him at all. Not once did he imagine she was raising a child. Not once did he imagine the possibility of being a father. Not once did he think he had another life growing in the world with his eyes and his smile. He believed the divorce closed every chapter between them, but life had written an extra page he didn't know existed. Robert's wealth continued to rise. New deals, new partnerships, new opportunities. His bank account grew. His reputation expanded. His influence doubled. But his soul, it emptied out piece by piece. He grew quieter at work, shorter in conversation, more withdrawn at family dinners, more restless at night. Sometimes he drove through the city aimlessly, passing places he and Julene used to visit. The cafe near Midtown, the market on Howell Mill Road, the street where she once laughed so hard she cried, the apartment they first shared. He never stopped the car. He only watched from a distance, punishing himself with the memories. Buckhead felt like a mansion decorated with achievements, but hollow at its core. He built an empire, but he couldn't build peace. And in the back of his mind, a quiet thought kept echoing. I should have apologized. He never did. He never reached out. He never tried to fix what was broken. And the longer he waited, the more impossible it felt. The man who seemed to have everything was quietly losing himself. And while he crumbled just a few miles away, a little boy with his eyes was learning to walk, learning to laugh, learning to live, without knowing who his father was. Robert buried his pain in paperwork. Julene carried hers in silence. Life was moving them toward a collision neither one was ready for. Scott was 4 years old when he first began asking real questions, not the simple ones about colors, toys, or why pancakes tasted better on Saturdays. These questions carried weight, even if he didn't understand why. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a crayon in his hand, drawing stick figures on scrap paper while Julene folded laundry. She glanced over and noticed he had drawn 2 figures, one tall, one small. "Who's that?" she asked softly. Scott tapped the tallest one with his finger. "That's you." Her heart lifted, then tightened when he tapped the smaller figure. "And that's me." She waited for him to add more, but he didn't. He kept coloring, humming softly. For a moment, Julene thought she had escaped another day without facing the question she knew would eventually come. But later that night, while tucking him into bed, Scott held her wrist and looked at her with those wide eyes that reminded her so much of the man she once loved. "Mommy," he whispered, "do I have a dad?" The world didn't break, but Julene felt something deep inside her shift. She forced a smile, gentle, steady. "Why do you ask, baby?" Scott shrugged with the innocence only a child could carry. "Because Jordan at daycare said everybody has a mom and dad. But I don't see mine." Julene sat on the edge of the bed, breathing carefully. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind for years, what she would say, how she would say it, how she would protect Scott's heart without planting anger toward Robert. But rehearsing something and facing it were 2 very different things. "You do have a dad," she whispered. "Everyone does." Scott studied her face as if trying to understand the part she wasn't saying out loud. "So, where is he?" Julene's lips parted, but no sound came. She didn't want to lie. She refused to raise her son on false stories, but she also couldn't tell him everything. Not yet. Not when he was too young to understand heartbreak, pride, divorce, and the storm that pushed her away from the life she once had. "He's not here right now," she finally said. Scott frowned. "Does he know me?" The question felt like a blade. She swallowed slowly, keeping her voice even. "Not yet." "Why not?" Her chest tightened. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and sometimes their lives go in different directions." She brushed his curls gently. "But none of that is your fault. You are loved. You are wanted. You are a blessing." Scott nodded, accepting the answer, even though he didn't fully understand it. Children had a way of trusting the people who loved them most, even when the truth was too heavy for their age. When he drifted off to sleep, Julene stepped into the hallway, leaned against the wall, and let the tears fall silently. She didn't cry because she regretted raising Scott alone. She cried because she wished life had given him better. She cried because she knew the day would come when not yet wouldn't be enough of an answer. She cried because she remembered the moment she found out she was pregnant, days after the final papers were signed. She remembered calling Robert's number and hanging up before the first ring. She remembered his cold tone the last time they spoke. She remembered her pride. His pride. Their pain. She wanted to believe she made the right decision. That she protected her son from chaos. That she spared him from a father who wasn't ready to be one. But she also knew the truth. One day, Scott would have more questions. And one day she would owe him answers. Julene wiped her face and returned to his room. She sat beside him and whispered, "I promise you'll know everything when the time is right." The community helped soften the load. Miss Gloria knitted sweaters for Scott every winter. Mr. Calvin from the corner store always saved him a lollipop. The kids on the block treated him like a little brother. In their eyes, Scott didn't lack anything. But children grow. Curiosity grows with them. Identity grows with them. And some questions don't stay quiet forever. As Scott grew older, his interest in families deepened. He watched TV shows and pointed out fathers with their sons. He saw men carrying their children at the park. He watched Father's Day commercials with a thoughtful expression, never demanding, always observing. Sometimes he said nothing for days. Sometimes he asked Julene small questions like, "Were you alone when I was born? Did my dad ever see me? Is he nice?" And Julene always answered the same way, with honesty wrapped carefully in protection. One night, after a day full of questions she wasn't prepared for, she sat by herself in the quiet living room. The house was dark except for a small lamp. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a photo of Scott at his 3rd birthday, smiling with icing on his chin. She whispered to herself, "One day I'll tell him everything. One day he'll understand why I left, why I stayed silent, why I chose peace over chaos." Her voice cracked. But I hope that day doesn't come too soon. Yet deep down she felt something shifting in life's timing, a sense that the truth wouldn't stay buried forever, a sense that the past had begun moving toward her and Scott, quietly, steadily, without asking permission. Scott deserved the truth. He deserved to know where he came from. He deserved to look into his father's eyes someday and decide for himself the meaning of that connection. Julene didn't know how the reunion would happen. She didn't know when or where, but she felt it coming. And when that day arrived, nothing in her life, or Robert's life, would ever be the same again. The sounds of Piedmont Park returned slowly, children laughing in the distance, dogs barking, joggers passing, but for Robert, everything felt muffled. His eyes stayed locked on the boy standing beside Julene, the child who had just called her mommy, the child who looked so much like him, it felt impossible to deny. Julene shifted her body slightly, positioning herself between Robert and Scott without making it obvious. Robert noticed. He felt the sting of it more than he expected. He tried to speak, but his voice came out thin. "Julene, is he—" Julene lifted a hand gently, stopping him before he could finish the question. "Not here," she whispered. Her tone wasn't angry. It wasn't soft either. It carried the weight of 3 years. 3 years of silence. 3 years of rebuilding. 3 years of raising a child with no help. Scott looked between them curiously, his eyes moving from his mother's guarded expression to Robert's stunned face. "Mommy, who is he?" Scott asked, tugging on her shirt. Julene exhaled slowly. "He's someone I used to know." Robert's chest tightened. "Used to know." A phrase colder than winter. Scott tilted his head. "Like a friend." Julene forced a smile. "Something like that." Robert swallowed hard. He wanted to speak to the boy, to kneel and say hello, to ask his name even though he already knew it in his heart. But he didn't want to frighten Julene, or overstep. "Julene." He tried again. She didn't look at him this time. Her eyes stayed on Scott as she brushed a hand through his curls. "Baby, why don't you go sit on the bench for a moment? I'll be right there." Scott nodded and ran toward an empty bench a few steps away, swinging his small legs as he climbed onto it. Only when he was out of earshot did Julene lift her gaze to Robert. "Don't ask me that question here," she said quietly. Robert felt his throat tighten again. I didn't expect to see you. I didn't expect—" He paused, gathering himself. "Julene, please, I just need to know. Is he—" "Robert," she interrupted. "I said not here." The firmness in her tone shocked him, though he understood. The park wasn't the place to unpack years of silence, heartbreak, and unanswered questions. Not with Scott watching them from the bench, swinging his legs with innocent curiosity. But he couldn't hold it in. His voice cracked despite his attempt to steady it. "Julene, I deserve to know." Her eyes softened, but only for a second. "You deserved a lot of things 3 years ago too, but neither of us got what we deserved back then." He flinched at the truth buried in her words. She continued, keeping her voice low. "Right now he's just a child who wants to enjoy his afternoon. I won't let this moment scare him. I won't let your shock become his confusion." Robert nodded slowly. He understood, even if it hurt. "Can we talk, please? Somewhere private?" Julene hesitated, glancing toward Scott, who was now humming to himself while tapping his shoes together. "Tomorrow morning," she finally said. "There's a cafe near West End. We can talk there." Robert nodded again, grateful for the chance. "Okay, tomorrow." Before he could say anything else, Scott called out, "Mommy, look at the bird." Julene turned immediately, her face softening in a way only a mother's could. "I see it, baby." She took a step toward him, but stopped long enough to look back at Robert. "This conversation, it won't be easy." "I know," he whispered. "No," she corrected gently. "You don't." With that, she walked away, toward the little boy who trusted her completely, who knew nothing of the storm brewing between the adults standing nearby. Robert stood frozen as he watched her kneel beside Scott, pointing at the bird and smiling through the tension she carried. Scott leaned against her, safe, unaware of how much was about to change. For the first time in years, Robert felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope and fear. Because if Scott really was his son, Everything he thought he knew about his life, everything he built, everything he lost, everything he regretted, was about to be rewritten. But Julene wasn't ready to hand him answers. Not yet. Tomorrow would decide everything. The cafe was quiet the next morning, the kind of place where the air smelled of roasted beans and warm pastries. It sat a few blocks from West End, tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore. Julene chose it intentionally, a neutral space far from Buckhead, far from memories, far from eyes that once judged her. Robert arrived early, too early. He sat at a small table near the window, his leg bouncing under the table. He had barely slept. His mind replayed every second from the park, especially the way Scott looked at him with eyes he recognized from his own reflection. When Julene walked through the door, Robert stood instinctively. She paused, taking a breath before joining him. She sat across from him, calm on the outside, guarded on the inside. "Thank you for coming," Robert said softly. Julene nodded. "We needed to talk." Silence settled between them for a moment, thick but necessary. Neither wanted to rush what needed to be said. Robert finally exhaled. "Julene, I need to ask again." His voice trembled slightly. "Is Scott my son?" Julene looked at her hands, then lifted her gaze to meet his. "Yes." The word hung in the air, simple, quiet, world-changing. Robert's breath left him in a shaky exhale. His hand covered his mouth as he leaned back, overwhelmed. His chest ached with something deeper than shock, grief, regret, gratitude, confusion, all twisted together. "How old is he?" he whispered, though he already suspected the answer. 4. Robert closed his eyes. He felt that answer like a weight dropping straight through him. 4 years. 4 years of missed birthdays, missed first words, missed steps, missed memories. 4 years where he didn't even know to look for a child who carried his features. He struggled to speak. "Why didn't you tell me?" Julene inhaled slowly, steadying herself. "Because you weren't the man who could handle it back then." Robert opened his eyes, stung, but unable to deny it. "You were angry," she continued, "lost in work, lost in expectations you didn't even choose for yourself." Every conversation felt like a battle. I was breaking, Robert. I couldn't hold a family together while fighting for my own sanity. He listened, eyes lowered, absorbing every word like truth he had run from for too long. "When I found out I was pregnant," she said softly, "the divorce papers had already been signed. You had stopped calling, stopped checking in, stopped trying." "I didn't know," he whispered. "You didn't want to know," she corrected gently. "You were drowning in pride, and I was drowning in exhaustion." Robert's throat tightened. He touched the edge of the table as though grounding himself. "I would have stepped up. I would have tried." Julene looked at him steadily. "You say that now, but back then, you could barely look at me without tension filling the room. You couldn't process your own emotions, much less a child's." He didn't argue. He couldn't. She was right. "I needed peace," she said. "I needed space to breathe. And Scott needed stability, not a father who wasn't ready to be one." Robert swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." Julene blinked, surprised by the softness in his voice. "I'm sorry for every day I didn't show up the way you needed," he said. "I'm sorry for letting work come before us. I'm sorry for every argument that should have been a conversation. I'm sorry for letting you walk away without chasing you." His voice cracked. "And I'm sorry I didn't know about my son." He lowered his head, shoulders trembling slightly. Julene watched him, really watched him, and saw something she hadn't seen in years. Not anger, not defensiveness, not pride. Remorse, real, human remorse. Robert wiped his eyes, though he tried to hide it. "I missed 4 years," he whispered. 4 years I can't get back." Julene folded her hands. "I didn't tell you to punish you. I told you because I didn't trust the version of you I left. That version of you would have resented the responsibility. That version of you would have buried himself in work even deeper." He nodded slowly. Deep down, he knew she was right. The man he was back then couldn't have handled fatherhood. He could barely handle himself. "But people change," Robert said quietly. "The man I am now wants to know his child, wants to understand what he missed, wants to make it right." Julene looked out the window for a moment, watching cars move along the street. "I don't want to keep Scott from you. I never wanted that, but I have to protect him." She looked back at Robert. "If you're going to be in his life, you have to show up consistently. No disappearing. No emotional distance, no excuses. Robert nodded immediately. I understand. And I need to be sure this isn't guilt talking, she added. I need to know you want to be there because you want a relationship with him, not because you feel obligated. I want to know him, Robert said firmly. I want the chance to try. Julene studied his face carefully. She saw honesty there, pain too, but also something new, a quiet resolve. Then we'll take it one step at a time, she said. For Scott's sake, Robert breathed out, relief mixing with fear. Can I meet him? Really meet him? Julene hesitated, just long enough to show she was protecting her son with her entire being. Yes, she finally said. He deserves that. Robert nodded, emotion tightening his jaw. Thank you. Julene took a slow sip from her cup. This won't erase the past, but it might build something better. Robert whispered, I hope so. For the first time in years, they sat in silence without anger between them, only truth, and the fragile possibility of something new. Tomorrow, Scott would officially meet the man whose eyes he carried, and none of their lives would ever be the same. The next afternoon, Julene stood outside the small playground near West End, her hand wrapped gently around Scott's. The sun filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows over the slides and swings. Children's laughter filled the air, but Julene's heart beat in a slow, cautious rhythm. Today would change everything. Scott swung their hands back and forth, carefree. Mommy, who are we meeting? Julene kneeled to his height and brushed a loose curl from his forehead. Someone important, baby. He stared at her with big, curious eyes. Are they nice? Julene forced a steady smile. I think so. Before Scott could ask more questions, Robert approached from across the field. He moved slowly, as if afraid to take a step too quickly. He wore a simple button-down shirt, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed Buckhead wealth. For once he looked like a man trying, not a CEO, not a polished figure, just a man. Julene watched him silently. Scott watched Julene watching him. When Robert finally reached them, he paused a few feet away, kneeling immediately so he wouldn't tower over the child. Hi, he said gently. Scott blinked. Hi. Robert's voice softened further. My name is Robert. Scott considered this, tapping his chin like he had seen Miss Gloria do when she was thinking. Are you Mommy's friend? Julene's breath caught. Robert looked up at her briefly, searching for guidance. Julene gave a tiny nod. Yes, Robert said, looking back at Scott. I'm someone who cares a lot about both of you. Scott seemed satisfied with that answer, for now. He pointed at the playground. Do you want to see me go down the slide? Robert blinked, overwhelmed by the simplicity of the request. I would love that. Scott grabbed his hand without hesitation. Julene's breath lodged in her throat at the sight. Scott's small hand curled inside Robert's larger one. It was natural, effortless, almost too perfect to look at. Robert's fingers trembled slightly as he allowed Scott to pull him toward the slide. It was the first time he had ever felt the warmth of his child's touch. The first time he felt the weight of fatherhood, not as a concept, but as a living, breathing reality. When Scott climbed the ladder, Robert stood at the bottom with his hands, half raised, unsure whether he should catch him or simply cheer. He settled for cheering. You got it, Robert called out. Scott slid down and landed with a soft thud. He laughed, bright, joyous. Robert laughed too, a sound Julene hadn't heard from him in years. Scott ran to him again. Did you see me? I saw everything, Robert said, meaning it on more than one level. Julene watched quietly from a few steps away. Her heart pulled in two directions, one part aching from memories, another part swelling at the sight of Scott's joy. This moment was bigger than pain, bigger than the past, but she still held her guard. After Scott played for a while, he returned to the bench where Julene sat. Robert followed, giving them a little space. Scott crawled into his mother's lap. Mommy, can he come again? Julene hesitated. We'll see, baby. Scott frowned. But I like him. Robert closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. Scott's innocence sliced through him in a way no adult's words ever could. Scott then turned toward Robert. Do you have kids? Robert shook his head. No. Just you. Scott blinked slowly, taking in the words. So, I'm your kid? Julene's breath caught. This wasn't how she intended the question to come. She opened her mouth, but Robert lifted a hand gently, not to interrupt, but to silently ask permission to answer. Julene nodded once. Robert leaned forward, choosing each word with care. Yes. You're my son. Scott stared at him. Not shocked, not confused, just quiet, processing. Then, softly, so, where were you before? The world seemed to still. Even the breeze paused. Robert swallowed hard. I didn't know about you, buddy. If I did, I would have been here, from the first day. Scott climbed off Julene's lap and walked toward Robert, standing directly in front of him. But you know now? Yes, Robert said, and I'm not going anywhere. Scott nodded as if accepting a simple fact, then climbed onto the bench beside him. Okay, just like that. A child's acceptance, pure, uncomplicated. Julene felt something shift inside her, a mix of relief and fear. Scott was connecting fast, too fast. And she knew that once he bonded, it would be impossible to protect him from disappointment. Robert sensed her tension. He looked at her carefully. I want to be part of his life, he said, voice steady. Not just today, not just out of guilt. I want to know him. I want him to know me. Julene crossed her arms slowly, protective instinct rising. Wanting it now is one thing, Robert. Showing up every day is another. I will, he promised. You said you would show up in our marriage too, Julene reminded him quietly. He didn't argue. He let the truth sit between them. Scott interrupted gently, tugging Robert's sleeve. Can you push me on the swing? Robert smiled, his voice thick. Yeah, of course. Julene watched as Scott ran toward the swing set. Robert followed behind him, eyes soft, steps lighter than she'd ever seen. She stood still, arms folded, emotions swirling. She wanted Scott to have everything, to know love from all directions. But she also needed certainty, stability, consistency, and Robert had to prove he was ready for that. Scott swung back and forth as Robert pushed him, laughter filling the playground. And for a moment, time allowed them all to breathe. Julene whispered to herself, please don't break his heart. Scott was unknowingly becoming the bridge, the small, beautiful link, between a painful past and a future none of them were prepared for. Robert took a slow breath as he waited outside the West End Park, watching families walk by, watching Scott chase a bubble wand he insisted on bringing. Today wasn't just another meeting. Today was the first time he would invite Julene and Scott into his world, a world that had felt colder ever since they left it. Julene approached with Scott's hand in hers. She wore a simple denim jacket and a soft-colored top. Nothing fancy, nothing loud. Yet Robert had never seen anyone carry themselves with more quiet strength. You ready? He asked gently. Julene lifted her chin. As ready as I can be. Scott looked up. Where are we going? Robert crouched down to his height. To my home. I want to show you both something. Scott nodded eagerly. Julene hesitated, not because she feared the place, but because she remembered exactly how Buckhead once felt. When she lived there, polished, wealthy, and full of people who made her feel like she didn't belong. Still, she followed Robert toward his car. The drive from West End to Buckhead was only 20 minutes, but emotionally, it felt like crossing countries. Neighborhoods shifted, from murals and local shops to manicured lawns, luxury sedans, and gated homes. Scott pressed his face to the window. Mommy, these houses are huge. Julene forced a smile. Yeah, they're pretty big. Robert glanced at her through the rearview mirror. He could sense her discomfort, the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her hands tightened around her purse. He remembered this look. He had once been too blind to understand it. Now, he saw it clearly. When they pulled into the long driveway of his Buckhead home, Scott gasped. Mommy, is this a hotel? Robert laughed softly. No, buddy, this is just where I stay. Julene held Scott's hand as they stepped out. The air felt different here, quieter, controlled, expensive. Inside, the house was open and spotless, decorated with sleek furniture and silver accents. Julene glanced around, remembering how many arguments sprouted within these walls. She ran a hand lightly over the back of a chair. Nothing's changed. Robert shook his head. A lot has changed. You just haven't been here to see it. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed from the hall. Two women Robert hired for light housekeeping walked in, pausing when they noticed Julene and Scott. Their eyes flicked over Julene's clothes, then her hair, then her shoes. One of them whispered something under her breath before forcing a polite smile. Julene felt it immediately, the same quiet judgment she faced years ago. The same atmosphere that made her feel like an outsider in her own marriage. Scott tugged her jacket. "Mommy, why are they staring?" "It's okay, baby," she whispered. Robert turned sharply toward the women. His voice dropped. "Do you need something?" They froze. "Oh, no, sir. We were just leaving." Robert's stare didn't budge until they hurried out. When he looked back at Julene, he saw that familiar hurt in her eyes. A hurt he once ignored. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "That shouldn't have happened." Julene pressed her lips together. It always happened. He didn't argue, because she was right. He motioned toward the living room. "Come sit. There's something I want to show you both." Scott ran ahead, curiosity taking over. Julene walked more slowly. On a shelf by the fireplace was a wooden box. Robert opened it carefully and pulled out a small silver bracelet, a child's bracelet. He placed it in Julene's hand. She froze. "I don't understand." "I bought it 3 years ago," he said. "The night after we signed the divorce papers." Julene stared at him in disbelief. "I didn't know you were pregnant," Robert continued, "but I knew I had lost something important. I told myself I was buying it for someday. I didn't know who it was for. I only knew there was an empty space in my life." Emotion tightened her chest. Scott wandered over, peeking at the bracelet. "Is that mine?" Robert smiled softly. "It can be if you want it." Scott grabbed it happily and ran off again. Julene watched him, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's adjusting fast." "He's not the only one," Robert replied. Before she could answer, a knock echoed from the open foyer. A well-dressed couple from Robert's business circle had arrived uninvited. They often stopped by when they saw his car in the driveway. "Robert," the woman called out as she stepped inside. "We didn't know you had company." Her eyes landed on Julene and Scott. Her smile faltered. "Oh," she said slowly. "I didn't realize you were entertaining guests from West End." The tone, sharp, patronizing, stabbed through the room. Julene felt her heartbeat thump in her ears. Robert's jaw clenched. "They're not guests. They're my family." The woman blinked. "Family?" "Yes," Robert said. "So if you can't speak with respect, you can see yourself out." The couple looked stunned. This wasn't the Robert they were used to, but they quickly exited. Julene stared at him, breath unsteady. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Robert said softly. "I did. I should have done it a long time ago." For the first time since the divorce, Julene's eyes softened without resistance. She saw not the man she once left, but a man trying to grow. Scott ran back into the room with a toy from Robert's shelf. "Mommy, look what I found." Julene knelt to him, smiling. "That's nice, baby." She looked up at Robert. A small, fragile thread of trust had formed, thin as air, but real. For the first time in years, Buckhead didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like possibility. Julene didn't know what to expect the next day, but when Robert suggested taking Scott to the Georgia Aquarium, she agreed, hesitant but hopeful. Scott's excitement alone was enough to make her say yes. He talked the entire car ride there, pointing out every billboard and asking if whales were as big as our house or if fish ever get bored of swimming. Robert listened to every question as if each one were precious. He answered with patience, humor, and curiosity, 3 qualities Julene rarely saw in him during their marriage. When they reached the entrance, Scott's eyes widened at the giant mural of sea animals. "Mommy, look, look," he shouted, practically bouncing. Julene laughed and tightened her grip on his hand. "I see it, baby." Robert walked beside them, ticket envelope in hand, watching Scott with a tender expression he didn't even try to hide. Inside, the bright blue lights reflected across the polished floors, creating a calm glow that wrapped around them. The first exhibit they approached held colorful fish drifting through coral structures. Scott pressed his palms to the glass. "They look like tiny rainbows," he said. Robert knelt beside him. "This one is called a parrotfish, and that one over there, see the stripes? That's a clownfish." Scott gasped. "Like the movie." "Exactly," Robert said, smiling. Julene watched them quietly. She remembered the man she once lived with, cold, overwhelmed, rigid. Here he was kneeling on the floor beside a 4-year-old, teaching him fish names with enthusiasm that didn't feel forced. Something warm spread through her, soft and confusing. They moved into the main tunnel, where sharks glided overhead. The curved glass surrounded them on all sides, and the blue world felt endless. Scott shouted, "Whoa, Mommy, that one's huge." Julene chuckled. "It sure is." Robert stepped closer to her, so close she could hear the shift in his breath. "He's incredible," Robert whispered, eyes still on Scott. Julene nodded. "He's everything." Robert's jaw tightened, not with stress, but with emotion he didn't quite know how to hold. "I wish I had known. I wish I could have been part of this from the beginning." Julene didn't respond. She stayed focused on Scott, but Robert could read the conflict in her silence. They reached the jellyfish exhibit next. The glowing creatures drifted slowly behind dark glass, lighting up like soft lanterns with every pulse. Scott pressed his forehead against the window. "Why they don't have bones?" he asked. Robert smiled. "They're made almost entirely of water." Julene raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Since when do you know so much about sea life?" Robert laughed quietly. "Since last night, after someone went to sleep." She blinked. "You studied? For him?" He looked down, a sheepish smile forming. "I want to have things to talk with him about. I don't want him to feel like he's teaching me everything." The sincerity in his tone took her breath for a moment. As they walked into the dolphin area, Scott squealed at the sight of trainers guiding dolphins through jumps and spins. The auditorium filled with cheers, and Scott clapped harder than anyone. When one dolphin splashed water across the front row, Scott jumped back in surprise, then burst into giggles. Robert ruffled his hair, laughing with him. "That's what happens when you sit too close." Julene's eyes softened. She hadn't heard Robert laugh like this since their early days, before pressure, before expectations, before everything fell apart. When the show ended, Scott tugged Robert's hand. "Can we see the penguins?" Robert pointed. "This way." They headed toward the penguin exhibit, passing a crowd of families. A small toddler ran in front of Robert, nearly bumping into him. Instinctively, Robert placed a hand behind Scott, guiding him away from the crowd with a protective reflex Julene didn't expect. Scott didn't notice. Julene did. Her heart thudded once, quiet but unmistakable. Inside the penguin room, cool air brushed over their skin. Scott leaned forward against the glass as penguins waddled across the rocks. "They walk funny," he declared. Robert laughed. "They do, but they swim like champions." Scott imitated their steps, waddling in a circle until he fell into Robert's arms, both of them laughing. Julene felt the corner of her lips lift. The sound echoed inside her, memories of better days, moments of warmth she thought were gone forever. She walked over and knelt beside them. "You're going to make yourself dizzy, baby." Scott leaned into her, still smiling. "But Mr. Robert caught me." Robert froze slightly, surprised by the title, but touched. "You can call me Robert, buddy. Just Robert." Scott nodded. "Okay, Robert." Julene's eyes met Robert's. Something passed between them. Not romantic, not nostalgic, but honest, real. They left the penguin exhibit and walked toward the ocean tunnel again. This time, Scott held one of Julene's hands, and one of Robert's. Julene didn't pull away. Robert didn't breathe for a second. Scott swung their hands happily. "We're like a team." Julene exhaled slowly. "Yeah, baby, we are." Robert blinked hard. His eyes glistened, but he masked it with a small smile. They reached the final gallery, a calm viewing area with benches facing, a massive tank where manta rays and whale sharks drifted peacefully. Soft music played overhead. Scott sat on the floor, tracing shapes in the air as he watched the animals. Julene and Robert sat on a bench behind him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Julene whispered, "I didn't think this would feel normal." Robert turned toward her. "Neither did I." She kept her gaze on Scott. "He likes you." Robert swallowed. "I like him too. More than I can explain." Silence lingered again, this time gentle, not tense. Finally, Julene let out a quiet laugh when Scott tried waving at a manta ray. Robert smiled. "You haven't laughed like that in a long time." She looked at him. Her eyes softened, walls lowering just a little. "It's been a long time since I had a reason." Their gazes stayed locked for a beat longer than expected, long enough to acknowledge something awakening between them. Something familiar, something tender, something they thought was gone. The moment didn't promise anything, but it hinted at everything. And for the first time since the divorce, neither of them ran from it. The sun began to settle behind downtown Atlanta as they stepped out of the Georgia Aquarium. The air had a light warmth to it, and Scott held the small gift shop penguin Robert bought him earlier. He squeezed it proudly against his chest. "Can we come back tomorrow?" Scott asked. Robert chuckled. "Let's see how today ends first, buddy." Julene smiled at the exchange, genuine, soft. For the first time in years, the three of them felt aligned, like the universe wasn't fighting their every breath. Like maybe, just maybe, healing was possible. They walked toward the parking deck, Scott hopping between the sidewalk lines, Julene and Robert walking, a comfortable distance apart but still close enough to feel the rhythm of each other's steps. Just as they reached the quiet corner near the entrance, a voice cut through the air. "Well, isn't this a pretty picture?" Robert's entire body stiffened. Julene froze mid-step. Scott clutched her leg instinctively. A man stepped out from behind a row of cars, jaw tight, dress shirt wrinkled like he'd been pacing for hours. Derek, Robert's former business partner. The same man who once envied Robert's success so intensely that he spread rumors about him to investors and nearly cost him a major deal. His eyes shifted from Robert to Julene, to Scott, and a smirk stretched across his face. "So this is why you've been avoiding meetings," Derek said. "You've been playing family in West End." Robert stepped forward immediately. "Derek, walk away." "Now, why?" Derek asked, folding his arms. "You afraid I'll say the truth out loud?" Julene's stomach twisted. "Scott, stay right here with me," she whispered. Scott pressed closer to her leg, clutching his stuffed penguin tighter. Derek tilted his head at Julene. "Funny seeing you again. Didn't realize you'd come back to claim your prize." Julene's eyes narrowed. "I don't know what you think you're talking about, but you need to leave." "Oh, I know exactly what's happening," Derek said, stepping closer. "You show up after 3 years with a child who looks exactly like him, pretending it's all a coincidence?" Robert's voice dropped dangerously low. "Derek, stop." But Derek kept going, each word sharper than the last. "You disappeared, Julene, and now you magically return the minute his company rebounds? The minute he gets investors again? Sounds like someone came back to cash in." Julene's breath caught, not in confusion, but in fury. "You don't know anything about my life." Derek laughed under his breath. "Oh, I know your type. Leave a man, then show up with a child to secure the bag. Classic." Scott looked up at her with wide eyes. "Mommy, what does he mean?" Julene felt something inside her break, not from Derek's words, but from the fact that Scott heard any of them. Robert's voice turned thunderous. "You don't talk about her, ever, especially not in front of my son." Derek lifted an eyebrow. "Your son? You sure? She didn't bring paperwork." That was it. Robert moved so fast Julene barely saw the shift. 1 second he was beside her, the next his fist slammed into Derek's jaw. The crack echoed through the parking deck. Derek stumbled backward, grabbing his face. "You've lost your mind." "You talk about her or my child again," Robert hissed, "and you'll regret it." Julene's heart dropped. She grabbed Scott instantly and pulled him behind her. Her voice trembled with shock. "Robert, what are you doing?" Scott began to whimper, confused and scared. "Mommy, why is he hitting that man?" Robert turned, breathing hard, chest rising and falling like he was battling every demon from their past at once. He looked at Julene, not with anger, but with desperation. "I had to. You heard what he said. I'm not letting anyone disrespect you like that again." But Julene shook her head, tears gathering. "This isn't protecting us. This is the same anger that tore us apart." "That's not true," Robert insisted, stepping toward her. "I'm different." Derek, still clutching his jaw, spat toward the ground. "Yeah, real different. Still the same buckhead hothead who thinks money can cover everything." Julene flinched at the words, not because she believed them, but because once upon a time she feared they were true. Robert lunged again, but Julene's voice sliced the air. "Stop!" He froze. Scott buried his face in her stomach, crying quietly. Julene held him, rubbing his back, eyes never leaving Robert. "This can't happen," she whispered. "Not around him, not around me." "He insulted you," Robert said, voice breaking. "What was I supposed to do? Stand there and listen?" "Yes," Julene said firmly. "You're a father now. You control your actions. Scott doesn't need to see violence. He doesn't need to be scared of the man he just started to trust." Robert's expression collapsed. "I'm trying, Julene. I'm really trying." Scott whimpered, "Mommy, can we go home?" Julene's heart cracked. She pressed a kiss to his forehead. "Yes, baby. We're leaving." She turned to Robert, eyes shining with disappointment. Not hate, not anger, but something deeper. "You haven't changed," she said softly. "I can't do this again." Robert stepped forward, panic rising. "Julene, please, don't walk away. Not like this. Not again." But she shook her head and picked up her son. "I'm choosing peace this time." She took Scott's hand and began walking toward the exit. Scott looked over his shoulder at Robert, confused tears on his cheeks. Robert reached out helplessly, his voice cracking. "Julene, don't go." But she did. And the worst part? This time, she wasn't running. She was protecting her child. Sunday morning arrived quieter than usual in West End. The church on the corner, small, warm, filled with familiar faces, buzzed gently, with greetings, choir warm-ups, and the soft shuffle of hymn books. Julene walked in with Scott holding her hand, still shaken from the scene with Derek. She didn't want to return to the chaos of emotions, so she focused on the comfort this building always gave her. Scott clutched his small penguin, looking around curiously. "Mommy, can Robert come here too?" Julene forced a smile. Maybe one day. But inside, she doubted it. Yesterday's fears still gripped her. As they took their seats, the choir began singing softly. The pastor greeted everyone warmly. The congregation, mostly neighbors, friends, and elders who watched Julene grow up, smiled as she entered. They adored Scott. They supported Julene. And they worried about her quietly. Halfway through the service, just as the pastor began speaking about forgiveness and the courage to rebuild what was broken, the back door of the church opened. Julene stiffened immediately. Robert stepped inside. He wasn't dressed in one of his expensive buckhead suits. Instead, he wore a simple shirt and slacks, neat but humble. He looked out of place in the warm, community-rooted environment, yet his expression showed none of the pride he once carried. Only intention. Only sincerity. Whispers swept across the room. "That's him? Isn't that Julene's ex-husband? He came here?" Julene's hands shook slightly. Robert walked slowly down the aisle, every step deliberate. Scott's face lit up. "Robert." He tried to rush toward him, but Julene held him close. She didn't know what was about to happen. Robert reached the front pew but didn't sit. He turned toward the pastor. "May I say something?" he asked. The pastor nodded gently. "If your heart leads you here, speak." Robert stepped forward until he stood where the choir normally stood. He looked out across the congregation, people who had heard pieces of their story. People who watched Julene struggle alone. People who did not trust him. His voice trembled, but he didn't hide it. "My name is Robert," he said. "Some of you know me. Some of you have only heard the worst of me." Julene blinked hard. Robert continued, voice shaking with truth. 3 years ago, I failed my marriage. I failed Julene. I let pressure, pride, and expectations numb me. And when she needed me most, I wasn't there. The room fell silent. Julene stared at her lap, unable to breathe. "I didn't fight for her," Robert said. "And because of that, I missed years I can never get back. Years with the woman I should have protected. Years with a child I didn't even know existed." More whispers. Some shocked, some sympathetic. Robert lifted his eyes toward Julene, speaking directly to her now. "I blamed circumstances. I blamed work. I blamed everything instead of taking responsibility for the pain I caused. But the truth is simple. Julene didn't break our family. I did." Julene's breath stuttered. Robert clasped his hands, his voice cracking. "I came here today not to win anything back, but to acknowledge before God, before this community, before our son, that I was wrong." Scott climbed off the pew and walked straight to Robert, tugging on his pant leg. "Don't cry," he whispered. "I'm right here." Robert fell to his knees instantly, wrapping Scott in his arms. Emotion broke through every part of him. The congregation gasped softly at the rawness of the moment. Julene covered her mouth, tears burning behind her eyes. Robert whispered into Scott's hair, "I'm sorry I wasn't there earlier. I'm so sorry, buddy." Scott hugged him tighter. When Robert stood, he faced the congregation again. "I want to be better," he said. "Not just for Julene, not just for Scott, but for myself. I want to grow, I want to change, and I want to show them, Not with promises, but with action. Julene couldn't hold back anymore. Tears streamed down her cheeks. The pastor stepped closer. "Growth is not proven in comfort," he said. "It is proven in humility, and today we see a man who is humbling himself." Robert lowered his head. Julene stood slowly, almost involuntarily. She didn't go to him at first. She simply stood, holding Scott's hand, letting the weight of the moment settle inside her chest. He saw her stand and looked at her with eyes full of remorse and hope. She took one step toward him, then another. The congregation watched silently. When she reached him, she lifted a trembling hand and touched Scott's back. Her voice cracked. "I never wanted to grow alone." Robert exhaled shakily. "I'm here now. Not halfway, not temporarily, fully present." Julene's tears fell harder as she whispered, "I don't know if I can trust everything yet, but I see you trying." The pastor smiled softly. Sometimes the beginning of healing is simply seeing effort. Scott looked between his parents, then hugged both of them, wrapping his tiny arms around their legs. The congregation collectively wiped their eyes. In that moment, under warm lights, surrounded by community, truth, humility, and love, Robert didn't just apologize. He transformed. The church service ended with warm embraces, soft words, and community members. Patting Robert on the back, some in support, others in cautious curiosity. Julene still held Scott close as they stepped outside into the afternoon sun. The air was mild, and for a moment, everything felt calm and restored. Scott skipped ahead, holding Robert's hand now, the three of them walking toward Julene's car. "Mommy," Scott said, tugging her sleeve, "can Robert come with us for lunch?" Robert smiled down at him. "Only if your mom says it's okay." Julene hesitated. Her heart was still raw from the public apology, still unsure of the road ahead. But seeing Scott's hopeful face and remembering the sincerity in Robert's words, she nodded. "Okay. Lunch sounds fine." Scott cheered and spun in a small circle. They were halfway across the parking lot when Julene noticed a black car parked along the curb. The windows were tinted. The engine was running. Her stomach tightened. "Robert," she said quietly, slowing her steps. "Do you see that?" Before she could finish, the back door of the car flew open. A man jumped out. It happened fast, too fast. He scooped Scott up with one arm and shoved him toward the open door. Julene screamed. "Scott!" Robert lunged forward instinctively, but the man pushed him hard, forcing him to stagger backward. Scott cried out, kicking and screaming. The penguin toy fell to the pavement. Julene ran toward them, her hands shaking, her voice trembling. "Let him go." She recognized the voice that barked orders from inside the car. "Derek, move," he shouted. "Get the kid inside." Scott sobbed harder, his little arms flailing helplessly. "Mommy, Mommy." Robert's panic transformed into something sharper, stronger, pure instinct. He pushed himself off the ground and sprinted toward the car just as the man attempted to shove Scott inside. "Don't touch him," Robert roared, slamming into the kidnapper with full force. The impact was brutal. The man toppled sideways, releasing Scott, who fell to the pavement. Robert grabbed him immediately, shielding him with his body. Julene ran to them, dropping to her knees and pulling Scott into her arms. "Baby, are you hurt? Talk to me." Scott sobbed uncontrollably, clinging to her neck. Derek stepped halfway out of the car, shouting, "You ruined everything again, Robert, everything. The board won't side with you now. I'll make sure of it." Robert glared at him, chest heaving. "You crossed a line you can't come back from." Derek smirked bitterly. "You never deserved the life you had. And she," his eyes flicked to Julene. "She's dragging you down again." Robert stepped in front of Julene and Scott, his entire body radiating fury and protection. "You come near them again, you'll answer for it." Derek ducked back inside the car and shouted at the driver. Tires screeched as they sped away, leaving a trail of dust and the echo of their engine behind. Silence fell, broken only by Scott's crying. Julene cradled him tightly. Her heart hammered against her ribs like it was trying to escape. She turned to Robert, tears streaming down her face. "He tried to take our son," she whispered. He actually tried." Robert knelt in front of her, his voice trembling but steady. "I won't ever let anything happen to him. I swear it." Julene looked at him through fresh tears. For the first time, she wasn't seeing the man she divorced. She wasn't seeing the man who once walked away from emotional responsibility. She was seeing a father, a protector, A man who would fight for them without hesitation. Scott hiccuped, his face buried in her shirt. Robert touched his back gently. "You're safe now, buddy," Robert said. "I promise." Scott lifted his tear-streaked face. "Robert, you saved me." Robert's throat tightened. "I'll always save you." Julene watched that exchange with trembling breath. Her heart, already softened by the apology in the church, shifted again, breaking open with something deeper than fear. This wasn't the Robert she left. This wasn't the man controlled by pride and pressure. This was a man transformed by fatherhood and love. She wiped Scott's cheeks gently. "It's okay, baby. We're here." Robert stood slowly, helping Julene to her feet. His hand lingered at her elbow, steadying her. She didn't pull away. "Julene," he said, voice softer now. "I'm so sorry you had to see that. I'm sorry Scott had to go through that because of me." She shook her head. "This wasn't your fault. Derek is responsible for his own choices. But I should have seen it coming," Robert said. "I should have protected you both sooner." "You protected us today," she replied. "That matters." Robert swallowed hard. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep you both safe. Whatever it takes." Her eyes locked with his, slowly, tenderly, but with a depth she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "We should go home," she whispered, holding Scott. "He needs rest." Robert nodded. "I'll follow behind you. I'm not letting you drive home alone after this." Julene didn't argue. Scott rested his head on her shoulder, still clinging to her with tiny, trembling fingers. But his eyes drifted toward Robert, full of trust and relief. Moments like this, moments forged in fear, had a way of bonding people in ways words never could. As they walked toward the car, Julene reached out with her free hand and touched Robert's arm lightly. "Thank you," she said. He didn't respond with words. He just placed his hand over hers, holding it for a brief, powerful moment. In that single touch, Julene realized something she hadn't dared to believe until now. Robert had changed. Truly changed. And she wasn't alone anymore. 3 weeks passed after the kidnapping incident, and life in West End slowly returned to rhythm. The police took Derek into custody, and the community rallied behind Julene and Scott with an outpouring of support. Neighbors stopped by with groceries. Church members called daily to check on them. Even Mrs. Hill from across the street brought Scott little toys just to see him smile again. But the person who showed up the most? Robert. Not with grand gestures. Not with apologies repeated over and over. He showed up with action. He fixed the loose railing on Julene's porch. He walked Scott to daycare when Julene worked early shifts. He sat with them during evenings when the fear resurfaced. He didn't press Julene for answers about their future. He didn't push for affection or make promises he couldn't keep. He simply stayed. One afternoon, as the three of them sat on Julene's small front steps, eating peach popsicles from a local shop, Scott leaned his head on Robert's arm. "You're here a lot now," he said casually. Robert smiled, because the first want to be. "Does that mean you're my dad every day?" Scott asked. Julene inhaled sharply, freezing mid-bite. Robert looked down at him. "Yeah," he whispered. "Every day." The way Scott smiled, slow, relieved, glowing, made Julene's throat tighten. Scott hopped up. "Mommy, can Robert come with us to the park later?" Julene looked at Robert. His eyes held no pressure, just hope. "Yes," she said softly. "He can come." Scott cheered and ran inside to get his shoes. As soon as he disappeared, Robert's expression grew serious. "Julene." She met his gaze, soft brown to quiet blue. "You don't have to say anything yet," he said. "I just want you to know I'm not going anywhere." Julene felt warmth spread through her chest, something she'd pushed down for years, something she thought she lost. But it was still there, waiting, healing. 3 days later, Julene stepped outside to find the entire street filled, with familiar faces, neighbors, church members, families from the block. Children played with balloons. Elders sat in fold-out chairs. The air carried the sound of laughter and music. At first, she panicked. "Scott, come outside but stay next to me." She scanned the crowd, and then she saw him. Robert, standing under the big pecan tree at the corner. No suit, no polished shoes, just a simple shirt and jeans. He looked like a man stripped of ego, standing in the very community he once overlooked. He stepped forward slowly as the crowd parted for him. Scott walked proudly at his side, holding both their hands together. Julene's breath trembled. "Robert, What is this? He stopped right in front of her. This, he said softly, is me choosing to stand in the place where you rebuilt your life. The place that protected you when I didn't. The place that raised our son even when I didn't know he existed. Tears filled Julene's eyes. I failed our marriage once, Robert continued. Not because I stopped loving you, but because I stopped growing. I let my world get too loud to hear your heart. I let pride blind me. I let expectations cage me. He dropped to one knee. The crowd gasped. Scott grinned. Julene covered her mouth as tears spilled over. But this time, Robert said, I'm not asking you to move to Buckhead. I'm not asking you to fit into my world. I'm asking to be part of yours, the world that made you strong, the world that raised the boy I love more than my own life. Scott placed a small ring box into Robert's hand. Open it, Robert. Robert smiled through a shaky breath and opened the box. Inside was a modest, elegant ring. Not flashy, not expensive, but meaningful. Julene stared at it, tears falling freely now. Robert looked up at her. Julene, will you marry me again? Not for who I was, but for the man I'm becoming, for the father I want to be, for the family we can rebuild with honesty, patience, and love that we grow day by day. The entire street went silent. Then Scott tugged Julene's dress. Mommy, I want us to be a team forever. That simple sentence broke her completely, in the best way. Julene dropped to her knees, cupped Scott's cheeks, kissed his forehead, then looked at Robert. You fought for us, she whispered. You didn't do that before. I'll fight every day, Robert whispered back. Julene nodded slowly, tears pouring. Then yes, I'll marry you. The crowd erupted. Cheers, clapping, joyful shouts filled the air as Robert stood and pulled Julene into his arms. Scott wrapped himself around both of them, a perfect bridge between past and future. The pastor from their church stepped forward, smiling warmly. Well now, no need to delay. If y'all want, we can do this right here. Julene laughed through tears. Right here is perfect. Neighbors formed a circle. Children tossed flower petals. The choir members who happened to be present hummed a soft harmony. The pastor lifted his hands. Julene and Robert, marriage is not a restart, it is a rebuild. And rebuilds are stronger when the foundation is honesty and growth. Julene squeezed Robert's hands. Robert whispered, I'm not letting go again. Scott stood between them, proudly holding both their hands. The pastor continued, Do you promise to listen, not just speak, to grow, not just demand, to build a home where this child, your child, feels safe, cherished, and loved? I do, Robert said. I do, Julene echoed. And do you promise, the pastor added, to forgive what is behind you and walk together toward what is ahead? They answered in unison, We do. The pastor smiled. Then by the power given to me, I declare you husband and wife. Scott threw both hands in the air. We're a team. Laughter filled the street. Robert kissed Julene with a love reshaped by humility. Julene kissed him back with a heart reborn in hope. Their second beginning started right there on the warm pavement of West End, where love returned not because life was perfect, but because they grew. Life doesn't always give us perfect beginnings, but it will always give us another chance if we're willing to grow for the people we love. If this story moved you, inspired you, or touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe to Stories by Mr. Flex. Your engagement helps us share more powerful lessons wrapped in unforgettable stories.